Do Americans like watching brown children suffer? Or does it just feel that way? As the US pumps the world with images of the wealth, power, heroism, and beauty of its citizens, the movies received well by Western reviewers about places like India tend to look a lot like this. Poverty porn, the unofficial genre of gruesome third world misery, often starring children who, get this, are poor in real life. It just makes it more realistic if you can tell they've really suffered. India, as the embodiment of poverty in the Western imagination, gets this treatment pretty regularly, with institutions like the Oscars rewarding depictions of Indian poverty beyond any other portrayals of India.
Katagira, know that you are empowering women all over the world to fight for menstrual equality.
So how did this trend start? Why is this a thing? Let's try to figure this out. So in 1948, a man named Vittorio De Sica released a movie called The Bicycle Thieves, about a man who really wants his bicycle back and doesn't fucking get it. De Sica was part of the Italian neo-realist film movement. It marks his backlash against both the censorship of Mussolini and the rank materialism and escapism of Hollywood. These films focus on the harsh realities of poverty, with characters that are sex workers, criminals, cute crying children. It was a leftist call to action, an attempt to guilt the public into caring about poor people. Good luck. A couple thousand miles away, a man named Satyajit Ray, Satyajit. I'm white, I'm trying. Sees The Bicycle Thieves and is like this. He starts the Apu trilogy. And yes, if you're not South Asian and the name Apu rings a bell, the Simpsons character name that got turned into an anti-brown slur does come from this movie trilogy. The 1955 Pather Panchali was the first of these three movies, and is the story of a poor boy growing up in rural Bengal. And like many neo-realist films, it is beautifully shot, beautifully active, and beautifully depressing. It's the kind of movie people watch in film school, if you know what I mean. Or if you're Bengali and you like that sort of thing. Ray showed the film to a director named John Huston, who then showed it to his friend who ran a little museum called the MoMA, patronized by the intellectual crowd. They showed the film without subtitles at an exhibition called Textiles and Oriental Arts of India. And even without the English subs, this movie was a huge hit. And to be fair, this was the US's introduction to Ravi Shankar, who did the soundtrack. The movie received widespread acclaim across the West, with exceptions like director Francois Truffaut, who said, I don't want to see a movie about peasants eating with their hands. Despite the fact that the Indian film industry predates Hollywood, this was actually the first South Asian movie to get attention in the US. And so began a beautiful relationship of misunderstanding, where Indians would make social realist films, and Hollywood would be like, look how poor these people are. The next movie to get Western/Oscars attention was the 1957 movie Mother India, the story of a strong, virtuous village mother fighting to save her farm and two hungry children, a clear metaphor for the nascent nation itself. This was a film with overt socialist messaging, extolling the virtues of India's toiling farmers, lamenting the greed of the moneylenders who exploit them, with a strong bicepty mother as both the embodiment of motherhood and the motherland. But taken out of context, this could again be seen as, look how poor these people are. Despite the fact that socialist messaging in Indian film waned over time, to be balanced out and even replaced by the stories of the rich and the middle class, the Indian movies receiving attention in the West continued to focus on poverty. The next Indian film to be acknowledged by the Oscars was the 1988 film Salam, Bombay, by director Meera Nair, starring an adorable, real-life street child. Like Pather Panchali, this movie is beautifully shot, beautifully performed, beautifully depressing. Every character is either a pimp, a sex worker, an abused child, or a junkie. By minute 9 of the movie, an underage girl is being sex trafficked. By minute 27, our protagonist is smoking heroin. And by minute 50, I stopped watching because I had actually like being happy. This film did really well domestically, but unlike most Indian films, it was a huge hit in the West, with Western reviewers calling the movie unflinching, fiercely unsentimental. Time magazine wrote that Salam Bombay deserves a broad audience to open American eyes to plights of hunger and homelessness abroad. See, in America, we don't have hungry or homeless people, just winners and quitters. This child, she quit. Interestingly, the same director's next film was Mississippi Masala, starring Denzel Washington and Sarita Chowdhury, a movie that focused on American race relations from a brown-black perspective. I personally think it's a much better movie, but it barely got any critical attention. No one was calling this movie unflinching or urging Americans to the theaters to open up their eyes to the plights of minorities at home. Because having a mirror held up to your own society is hard. And why isn't there a white man starring in this? Shouldn't Tom Hanks be in this? The 2001 film Lagan was the next film to gain some traction in mainstream America. An uplifting film set during the British rule of villagers who triumph in a cricket match against their English oppressors. But this depiction of India was nowhere near as big in the West as another little depiction of India made a few years later. The 2008 smash hit Slumdog Millionaire, which to this day is the portrayal of India people bring up to me the most. Probably because it's the most well-known depiction of India in the West. This was a film by British director Danny Boyle and co-directed by Loveleen Tandon. Once again, starring a real street child, and again featuring pimps, battered women, child abuse. There have been so many crude depictions of India in the West.
India, like life itself, I suppose, is about what you bring to it.
God dwells within me, as me.
I wants to make this trip a spiritual journey.
Did you just fuck that Indian girl?
But even so, Slumdog Millionaire is the one that seems to piss a lot of people off. Partially because the term slumdog just really isn't a thing. Even though this movie doesn't have the tone of your stereotypical poverty porn film, the music is upbeat, it's color saturated, energetic, and has a happy ending. It has the same themes: filth, crime, sexual predators, child abuse. And the word slum, of course, is in the title, harkening back to the Western obsession with Indian slums. The unfortunate thing was this was a genuine attempt of Danny Boyle to make a Bollywood meets Hollywood love letter to India, capturing the energy.
And the century that belonged to America, the last century, clearly belongs to Asia now. And one of the peaks or pinnacles or focus points of that will clearly be Mumbai.
Obviously inspired by Hindi film gems like Diwar or Gangs of Wasseypur. In fact, Boyle's previous film, Trainspotting, is a far more damning portrayal of UK poverty and society.
Doesn't it make you proud to be Scottish?
It's shite being Scottish! We're the lowest of the low! The scum of the fucking earth! The most wretched, miserable, servile, pathetic trash that was ever shot into civilization! Some people hate the English, I don't! They're just wankers! We, on the other hand, are colonised by wankers! Can't even find a decent culture to be colonised by!
But again, Danny Boyle didn't get a bunch of Oscars for Trainspotting. He only got them for Slumdog. Even though, again, I consider Trainspotting a much better movie. Slumdog Millionaire is, at best, a feel-good romp. Slumdog introduced Western audiences to many things: Bollywood cinema, South Asian musicians like A.R. Rahman and M.I.A., actor Dev Patel, who, despite his very thick London accent,
when cops in the police station speak in English, it doesn't seem correct to me. Or when the slum kid speaks in English and in a British accent,
managed to convince white producers that a brown man could star in a film and it would still make a profit. But for Indian audiences, the movie either didn't resonate, since it felt like a pastiche of Bollywood cliches, or was actively offensive, since it contained the usual Western gaze, one that focused on Indian poverty and solidified the connection between the words slum and India to people in the West. But you might be asking, what exactly is the problem with all this? What's the difference between a movie that depicts poverty and poverty porn? The term poverty porn first comes up in a British review of the 1999 movie Angela's Ashes, adapted from the novel of the same name by Frank McCourt. McCourt's memoir combined description of the harsh realities of life in an Irish slum with a deep sense of humor, but the adaptation was entirely one note and got panned by critics as ponderous, vomit-packed poverty porn. This term came to mean anything that not just showed poverty, but seemed to revel in it, that objectified it in an exaggerated and voyeuristic way. Just as a pornography doesn't help you, say, put yourself in the same shoes as a cheerleader who's failing out of Professor Hardcock's algebra class. Poor Tiffany. She just wants to study biomedical engineering at Georgia Tech. Poverty porn actually creates a distance between you and the protagonist, inviting a voyeuristic enjoyment of their situation. With regular pornography, the goal is sexual release, whereas poverty porn gives you a kind of good crygasm.
Many of us, including myself, left this film screening sobbing, and even talking about it, thinking about it now makes my eyes quite moist.
Positive reviews of these movies will always say things like this. I cried. If you want a good cry. The social realist films of Europe would use child stars in order to get the empathy of the viewer, because seeing a suffering child is one of the most powerful images a human being can view. The idea is, this could have been my child. This could have been me forced into survival sex. This could have been me forced to steal for my family. But with the divide of race and culture, poverty is exoticized. The viewer has the sense that this would never happen in my country. This would never happen to me. The image of a crying brown child in a theater in Mumbai will be received very differently than the same image in a theater in LA. The interesting thing about most of the movies accused of being poverty porn is most of them were made by people who didn't want to make a poverty porn. Pather Panchali was an Indian book adaptation mixed with stories from the director's actual childhood. Salam Bombay was made by an Indian director again and was very successful in India. Salam Bombay was an adaptation of a novel written by an Indian diplomat and was co-directed and co-written by Loveleen Tandon, who is Indian herself. And the plot was largely derived from popular Bollywood films. The problem with all these films goes beyond Western gaze and into context, the meta conversation happening in the entire world. The social realist films of the 1950s existed in part of a greater conversation, socialist internationalism, conversations about the degrading effects of poverty on the human spirit, and were kind of made to promote political consciousness and wealth distribution. But now movies that are made about Indian poverty exist in the neoliberal, neo-colonial context. The idea that white Western countries are wealthy, flourishing, and socially progressive. Children are never beaten. Women are never disrespected, and poverty never happens. The same language of social realism continues to be used, saying children, the same miserable circumstances, forcing people to commit crimes. But instead of jolting people into a state of political consciousness, these lull the Western viewer into a state of complacency. There's no call to action. We can't do anything about these abandoned children in faraway countries. And that's exactly the point. I find reviewers give more pushback to Western portrayals of poverty. Movies like Angela's Ashes, movies like Nomadland. These films get criticized, and justifiably so, as being fucking bummers that don't even give a realistic idea of what it's like to be poor because it's so exaggerated. But every time one of these films is showed in a foreign context, it's always seen as like undiluted reality.
It's really raw and real.
And the director is seen as like brave for admitting the truth. And meanwhile, poverty porn doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of the power porn films that America is flooding throughout the world. America, in the global imagination, is embodied as a throbbing, pulsating, sweaty white man saving the world. While India in the Western imagination remains the same helpless, dirty child, running with barefoot feet through the slums, who has been abandoned and needs saving. Imagine for just a second that America was a country that most people couldn't locate on a map, and people had only seen 2 movies about, like Grapes of Wrath.
Could you see your way clear to sell us a loaf of bread, ma'am?
This ain't a grocery store.
Taxi Driver.
She's 12 and a half years old. You ain't never had no like that. You can do anything you want with her.
There is a meta story here. The white savior, the brown dirty child. And this is the old myth of imperialism, the white man's burden. Images of helpless natives, sometimes buxom ladies, and sometimes skeletal, large-eyed children. And white male heroes coming to their rescue to save them from the pervy, swarthy man. And no matter what, if you make a documentary or film that shows these images, these almost archetypes, it triggers the exact same story in the Western imagination. America is Superman, Batman, Iron Man, all the mans. And India is reborn over and over as Apu, Krishna, Jamal as starving children. who need saving. And who could possibly save them?